It's another Friday night. It's time for the next episode of Echoes of Fear. I am Jason Hewlett here along with Kenton Moore. And Kenton, I know you were talking just before we hit play about opening Pandora's box and the Daily Bugle just fell apart. Whatever. I'll deal with that later. It was probably a ghost, which ties in nicely. I use that as a segue. So Kenton, what are we talking about the next 2 weeks?
All right. So, yeah, we're getting into Jason's bread and butter here, and we're going to talk about Phasmophobia, which is the fear of ghosts.
Boo. And, it's funny, like, out of all the phobias I know that you provide like what was there, 500 and something phobias or something like that?
Yeah, 551, yeah.
Out of all of them, this is the one to me that makes the most sense. Because ghosts have been a part of our culture and society. They're part of every culture and every society all over the world since the dawn of man. We have believed in ghosts.
Yeah. Something that comes after we die. That obsession with what happens post this life that we live.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is the fact that there's a phobia about it shows that none of us are quite content with the thought of dying because we don't know what's going to happen. And then the thought of something coming back after, quite often in early stories, to exact some form of revenge or warning or caution, I think just speaks to our fear of our mortality.
Yeah, and like as I mentioned before we hit record here too, in our early discussions, I sort of opened Pandora's box on the research for this one, which is fascinating to me. I mean, learning, and it's all my passion. And for people who know me, I was educated in university for a little bit anyway. I didn't graduate, but I majored in history and minored in anthropology. So this really lit that fire again, really going into the history and asking the hardest question: why are we afraid of ghosts?
And so what did you find in your research? And here's the thing that works out really well, because of everything Kenton just said. He is our researcher here. And he asked me when we first started talking about the show, he's like, well, I've got my research. Do you want me to send you bullet points? And I'm like, no, you bring the research and I will comment on it because I work better that way. But I think as we saw, especially in our Fear of Clowns episode, that works really, really well.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm really getting into this because I messaged Jason the other day before we came to this session today to record. And I said, my goal, my mission with this week is to come up with one fact, one anecdote, one piece of information that surprises Jason.
And I said, I hope so. Or good luck, because I would love that, because I've been an investigator researcher for more than 20 years. And I hate it, and we'll talk a bit about this on the next part 2, where we get into sort of pop culture and all that. I hate it when there's these shows that refer to these people on there as experts, because this is one field no one can be an expert in, because everything we're doing is strictly theory-based that cannot be tested, because the only way to find out the truth is when we die.
Yeah, exactly. And in all the research and reading that I've been doing, and I mean, I'm talking about everything from papers in the Frontiers of Psychology journal all the way to modern documentary series and a few different books on A to Z of phobias and stuff. And, the one thing I found is that almost all of it has a cultural bias. Right?
Oh, huge. And everybody brings their own bias into this, right? I mean, with the team that I'm a part of, Canadian Paranormal Society, like with Pete Wren and Olivia Aslan and company, we try to bring an unbiased approach to it. But even then, your experiences, especially when you're dealing with the supernatural, will kind of create a bias within you just by default. So it's really hard, but we try to approach every investigation and every bit of activity that comes up in an investigation with a skeptical eye first.
Right. Exactly. So I guess in the sense, the first question to ask before even why are we afraid of ghosts is what is a ghost? So interesting question to pose to you, my friend. What, in your definition, what do you believe a ghost is?
I have no clue.
Best answer.
Because people assume that what we're seeing as a ghost is the spirit of a deceased person that is either there's two forms of hauntings. There's what's called a residual haunting, and then there's an intelligent haunting. And it's exactly what you think. The residual haunting, also a part of what's called stone tape theory, is that something has happened, that energy has been left behind, and under the right circumstances, it replays itself over and over. But it's the exact same thing. For example, we investigated a residential school somewhere here in the province. We can't say where, but not here in Kamloops. We're at midnight, every few weeks, if you're outside near the fire escape, you can hear someone running up or down the fire escape. And it's just the same thing. It's just the same thing repeated. There's no variation on that. You can't interact with it. It just does that. That's a residual haunting. An intelligent haunting is very much the ones that you see outside of poltergeist activity in most of the movies, where we've had conversations with something, either via EVP, which is electronic voice phenomenon, or spirit box, or it's where it'll open a door for you, or something will roll across a table or come off a shelf. It's but it's interacting with you, with the belief being that it's trying to communicate in some way about something.
Awesome. And a perfect segue. So let's dig in to the history of ghosts. And getting into that history of what happens after we die, one of the oldest records I was able to dig up actually comes from Mesopotamia. Mm-hmm. And the Mesopotamians used to believe that the soul was called a giddim or an etemu. And it was an energy that manifests within ourselves to help animate life. And then going further into what you were talking about the different types of hauntings, it's fascinating because I also found records out of Egypt about one of the oldest known recordings of a quote unquote ghost story comes from the necropolis of Thebes. And in that story, which sadly the records were partly destroyed, so we lost the beginning of the story and we lost the ending of the story. So we have the middle, and essentially what we know is that a priest in the necropolis was roaming through the city and encountered a ghost. And where the story picks up in the parts we have, he returns to his place of residence. He does a ritual and he summons this ghost to find out, why are you still here? Now, the Egyptians had a very fascinating and one of the most in-depth studies on what happens, or belief systems on what happens after you die, collected, of course, in the famous Book of the Dead, or better translated into Book of Going Forth by Day.
That's a much more uplifting title.
It sort of is, right? But it's a collection of spells and directions and incantations on how the afterlife works in their belief system. And in those early days, they actually believed that the soul was three parts, right? So you had the ka, which was the part of your spirit that was your energy, it was your life force, and it would remain tethered to a place such as your tomb, right? And then you had the ba, which was your personality, it was who you were, who they believed manifested as a human head attached to a bird. And that bird could fly up and out of the tomb and go off into its adventures throughout the afterlife, ultimately leading to that faithful encounter with Anubis in the courts, where your heart would be weighed against the feather, and you would find out your worthiness, quote unquote. And if you were worthy, you would go to the field of reeds. If you were not, you were consumed by Amit and you went to their version of hell, right? But they also believed that if your Ka and your Ba were reunited, you would become an awakened spirit called an Ankh, right?
Yeah.
Which was super fascinating. But going back to this ghost story, this priest summons this ghost, and the ghost appears before him. And in conversations with him, he finds that this man, this individual, this lingering spirit, came from a tomb that was destroyed. It was forgotten and eroded over time. So the priest makes a promise to the ghost that he'll rebuild and fix this ghost's tomb, and thus allow him to rest and stuff. And unfortunately, that's where the story ends. But we can sort of extrapolate that based on the Egyptian belief system, that maintaining the Ka long enough for the Ba to finish its adventures in the afterlife was part of their belief system. So we could extrapolate that happened, which ties totally into your talk about the hauntings of interacting with people. They have a need that wasn't fulfilled or met in their lifetime and therefore cannot rest, right?
Yeah, if that is even actually the case, right? Like we're going on the theory that we're dealing with dead people here, the spirits of the dead.
Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting when they're talking about the Ka, where it was what remained in the tomb. That's, I think, where in modern times there is that whole idea that this house is haunted by a specific spirit, right? You know what I mean? Like there's the whole classic story of the ghost that just is tied to one place. And if you go in there, like, the Japanese kind of have their Ju-on story, like the Grudge, right? That if you enter this place where the spirit is, you cross its path and then whatever can happen, blah, 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 blah. So I think that's neat how what they're talking about there kind of helps explain what's going on today in some places and the different theories that have sprung up from that.
Right. Exactly. And and even in Rome, you had Pliny the Younger, not Pliny the Elder, his nephew Pliny the Younger, whose actual name was Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus.
That's a hell of a name.
Best name ever.
Right?
He wrote a ghost story about a man in Rome that there was this famous building that was haunted by a ghost that would appear to you as an old man in white rattling chains. And he wrote the story about a philosopher named Athenodorus. And Athenodorus found out about this house and was like, it's really cheap. I'm going to buy it. I don't care about ghosts. And he moved in and one night was writing and the ghost appeared to him rattling his chains and he chose to ignore it. Was like, to hell with you. I'm not going to listen to you. I'm going to focus on my writing. But the ghost persisted. And finally, Athenodorus put his quill pen down and looked upon the ghost, who then pointed with a finger and beckoned him to follow. So Athenodorus followed this ghost all the way to a courtyard at the center of the home, where it promptly vanished. So, wondering on why the ghost beckoned him this way, Athenodorus marked the spot where the ghost vanished with a handful of leaves, and the next morning called a magistrate of the city, who dug up the place and found the bones of a human being wrapped in a bunch of chains, who appeared to have been one of the builders buried during a collapse when the building was being erected. So they promptly gave him a proper burial and stuff, and as the story goes, the place was no longer haunted. So
that's a very, 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 very traditional ghost story, right? And I think those stories have influenced so much what people today think. And I think how I think too many investigators will approach a situation, like that there's some sort of deed that needs to be completed or like justice served or whatever, which from our experience and my experience isn't always the case. But again, we're going on this classical haunting ghost story theory. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like you mentioned before too with Japan, right? With they have the yurei, which are spirits. They're usually not human. They're creatures or otherwise. And then they have the what did you call them?
The Ju-on or whatever.
The Ju-on, yeah. Usually women, long black hair, white dress, no feet.
If you've watched The Ring or you've watched The Grudge or any of those, you've seen it.
I'm probably going to butcher this, but you're going to like this. I found this thing up in Japan. A ghost story is called the Kaidan.
Ooh, I like that, yeah.
And there's a game that they play that's called the Hyaku Monogatari Kaidankai.
Wow.
I probably just butchered the shit out of that. But basically the game is they light 100 tea lights, 100 candles, and they each take turns telling a ghost story, and then they blow a candle out. And the idea is that these stories get darker and more frightening as they go on, and when the last candle is blown out, something will be waiting for you in the dark.
It's like our their version of Bloody Mary or something like that, right? Or Candyman,
Yeah. And what I found fascinating was just how different the culture of ghosts in Japan was versus the culture of ghosts in China, for example. China has the famous Hungry Ghost Festival, which I'm sure you're aware of. And, they have this ancestral veneration there, just like we do with our First Nations and so many other cultures like the Latin cultures with their Dios de los Muertos.
Which is new. That's relatively new. The Santa Muerte Spirit and Festival, that's relatively new in comparison to the other cultures, right?
But again, another culture that venerates their dead. They have like an ancestral worship there. And it's funny because when you get into the West and you start looking at the West, spirits and ghosts were really only a providence of the church until the rise of Gothicism. And then you get into all sorts of stuff like monsters and ghosts and this fascination with the occult and all this. But specifically to the Western religions, Thomas Aquinas, he famously didn't believe in ghosts, or he famously did believe in ghosts, and claimed to have been visited by his sister once who couldn't rest because of something that happened. She didn't pray enough or whatever. So he prayed for her, and then he records that a year later he was visited by her spirit, who said that she was now in heaven. So even the church had very distinct and very anti related views, because Martin Luther, during the Protestant Revolution, did not believe in ghosts and claimed that they were demons sent to trick us, right?
Which that whole demon theory, we could call it, is very prevalent right now, strictly because it's being used in all those ghost shows, right? It became popular and people are suddenly making money off of it. So that view has come into play because... Oh, this is a whole other topic. but from my experience, and then Peter Wren, who's the co-founder of Canadian Paranormal Society, he is actually an investigator for a Catholic exorcist out of Washington State. He's been doing it for 10 years. That's his job.
Awesome.
One of his jobs. And in all those years, maybe you could count the number of cases that could potentially even be demonic on one hand, tops.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I found too. Like in the modern West, like where we are now, like you just talked about, it's tied into a lot with the rise of spiritualism and mediums. You know, the triplet sisters, and I can't remember their names off the top of my head.
Neither can I. I know exactly who you're talking about, though. Yeah.
Famously launched the whole, medium sort of.
Well, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was huge.
It was huge, massive. Like you could speak with your dead. And some cultures believe that some cultures way back in history believed that you could communicate past life. Taoism, the sages of Taoism famously believed that they could communicate with those who've moved on. First Nations, spirit journeys and all those kind of things, getting help and guidance from elders. It's a cultural belief. And what I found is in the prevalence of phasmophobia. So going away from the stories of ghosts and going into the why are we afraid of them, what I found was a 2009 Hopkins University study says that 9% of people are afraid of ghosts in some way.
9%?
9%.
That's not a lot when you stop and think about
it.
I mean, I guess if you think of 7 billion people on the planet, that's a lot. But...
Yeah, but ironically, that 9% is applicable only to the West.
Oh.
To the first developed world, right?
Really?
Yeah, believe it or not, Islamic culture has almost no fear of ghosts because they don't religiously believe in them. There's no lingering. Once you die, you're gone. You go one place or the other.
Yeah, that's interesting. See, that is something that a bit surprises me, but I only think it's because we're in the West and most of the people I've come across find it scary, who don't do the kind of work that I do, right? Like the thought of it is frightening to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you mentioned that because I found a paper from the Frontiers in Psychiatry written in 2018 in November. It was titled Phobia of the Supernatural, a distinct but poorly recognized specific phobia with an adverse impact on daily living. It was written by Ricardo de Oliveira Souza. Again, I apologize for butchering his name. But in it, he postulates that though the studies show 9% prevalence, he believes that it's actually far higher in that because most adults who suffer from this phobia are afraid to admit to anybody, especially medical professionals, that they are afraid of ghosts.
See, and that makes perfect sense because most people don't even want to bring up the subject for fear of ridicule, right? Because if you are afraid of ghosts, then you obviously believe ghosts are real, and there's still a taboo to that in our modern society. What I find is funny is I've met a lot of people, and actually almost everyone I know in this field has had the same kind of experience, where you'll come across someone who is that skeptic and they're openly kind of mocking the whole concept of it. Then when everybody else in the room leaves, that person comes up and goes, but you know what? I had this thing happen that I can't explain. And that is very, very common.
Oh, yeah. And, it goes back to one of those first few times that you and I ever met and hung out together. I remember being in the pub and having a beer. And I remember you telling me about when you were a journalist and you mentioned something or wanted to mention something and felt that you were at risk of ridicule in your...
Well, I couldn't have been a crime reporter if I had talked about being a paranormal investigator. Like
Right.
it would not have, I would have lost any credibility. I think today that wouldn't have happened because of how opinions have shifted. But yeah, back then, like we're talking early 2000s, there's no way, man. No way.
And don't you find that funny that everybody has that experience of sitting around a campfire telling ghost stories and getting that spine-tingling chill rising up your back? Everybody has been afraid of or been scared by a ghost story or something at least once in their life, but a huge disproportionate amount of people just choose to not believe it.
Well, I think because when you're talking stories, it appeals to that whole like the horror movie fan and all. A story is a story. Just because the story scares you doesn't mean you believe that what's happening is true.
Correct.
But the fact that, so many people believe in ghosts then means that some of those scary stories could be true, especially if someone goes, well, I was at home. Like I have a friend of mine, she doesn't believe in ghosts, but she remembers one time coming down out of her bedroom at night to the kitchen to get like a drink of water or something like that and saw someone standing in their living room.
Oh, man.
Which when there was no one who would have been standing in the living room. So she's like, I don't believe in ghosts, but was that a ghost? Because that was terrifying.
Yeah. And De Souza's paper goes into a whole lot about how people with documented phasmophobia almost 95% of the time have a comorbidity with another phobia, such as fear of the dark.
Right? Or any one of those other ones. I think because ghosts play into the fear of the dark too. Because it's usually at night, even though from my experience, you can see a ghost any time of the day. It could be bright daylight and you're going to see it. You can see a spirit have paranormal activity occur. But it's commonly associated with like nighttime, with like that BS 3 a.m. thing, you know what I mean? And all that stuff, which is total bunk. It's all about the dark and dying.
Yeah. And it was interesting too in De Souza's paper to read that the primary physical symptom associated or used to diagnose phasmophobia was a severe and irrational fear, like all phobias are, but specifically an inability to sleep without a light on or alone.
I could see that one too, because it plays into that really well, right? There's a place that we go every year down to Idaho, a place called Gooding, Idaho, and it's a former tuberculosis clinic. That is probably the most haunted places myself or Pete or Ollie or anyone on the team has been to, right? And I never have, when I was a kid, I had this fear of the dark. Like we mentioned in sort of the first few episodes where I had trouble falling asleep, but now I can sleep kind of not a problem. But there was one night during our trip last year that the vibe was so funky and like uncomfortable that I actually slept with the light on.
You should have had an infrasound meter,
right? But it was just like, it was like the last night we were there and we'd had stuff happen that was just unexplainable and it was uncomfortable that day. And it was just like, I was getting ready for bed and I'm laying there and I'm just like, you know what? Like, fuck this. And I turned the light on and I pulled the blanket over my head and went to bed.
Yeah. And you remind me of so many nights when I was on the ships, sitting in our little bunks, which is basically just not much larger than a coffin, with our closed curtain, listening to, 14 guys in a mess snoring away or farting. And air rushing and all that kind of stuff. But you're in this pitch black darkness and you'd wake up in the middle of the night because maybe a rogue wave hit the ship and you'd get that jarring bump wake you up. And you'd wake up and you just absolute blackness because you're in your little rack and, somebody's put tape over the red light in the mess because they can't sleep with that little bit of light on it. And then for a moment, you just have this like wash of panic. And then you realize where you are and you take a deep breath and you smell the sweat on your pillow and you just like find comfort again and back to sleep you go. Right?
I did a ferry ride from mainland Australia to Tasmania, and I was the exact same, the little bunk thing. It was at the front of the boat too.
Oh, nice.
So I totally, as soon as you mentioned like the rock of the wave, I can remember like we'd hit the waves head on, like gosh, and you just shake like that, and gosh, and you shake. Oh no,
we'll get into it in the Phasmophobia episode and stuff. But our ship actually had seatbelts in our rack.
oh my god.
But you know, just to kind of, you know, close off the point I was trying to lead to with all of this is what I found that fascinated me was, you know, 9% prevalence, like we said, evidence that it's much deeper than that because there's a stigma involved with admitting that you may or may not have this phasmophobia to the lengths that it's diagnosable. But what I found fascinating was 2 points. One, the fact that it had so much cultural relation. You know, like if you were from a culture that was raised or born or taught in ancestral worship or you know, revering the dead, you were far like significantly far less likely to ever develop a fear of ghosts. But one thing that was in common with every society that had any kind of fear of ghosts or any kind of ghost story prevalence was the fact that every ghost story that scares people, every reason anyone ever had to be afraid of ghosts, had to do with the fact of A, it's the ultimate unknown, and B, it's all about moral questions like, did I live a proper life? Did I die in an acceptable way? What am I carrying with me across that veil to the other side? Right?
Oh, 100%. 100%. As someone who's approaching 53, those questions have started to pop up in my head. Like, you know, the big one is, have I lived a good life? And I don't necessarily mean like, have I done everything I've wanted to do, but have I been a good person? Have I treated people properly? How do I feel about the times that I haven't?
Yeah.
Right. So that is totally understandable. And I think part of it too is then you're aware that you've got less time left to say maybe correct those things, to make amends, right? Because so many of those stories are right. It's about the wailing ghost, you know, La Llorona, who's like looking for her children, right? Yeah. Like it's all so much like the whole Scrooge, you know, that whole concept of him being a horrible person, and the ghost of one of his friends comes up to try to tell him, you got to fix this or you're going to end up just like me, basically, right? Like yeah, I can see that because I don't think we as people, especially today in our modern world, spend enough time pondering these questions. We just kind of go through the day-to-day motions of life and have been programmed, I'm going to get preachy here, to seek out the material as opposed to focus on being on the spiritual or just being a good human being. And I think that's where some people I know who are skeptical, like science, as great as it is, science is tied into capitalism and materialism. Ghosts are tied into spirituality. Spirituality is about the spirit, your spirit, right? It's very human. And we are being told not to focus on that and to focus on these other things. And I think we're seeing a resurgence in the spiritual right now. Right, capitalism. Not that all parts of capitalism are bad either, right? But I think we're seeing a reawakening of that right now, which I think is why more people are willing to talk about ghosts and are kind of facing that whole question. Yeah. Does that make sense? Anything I say here tie in anything we're talking about?
Jason dropping the mind bombs over here, and I am just loving it. I'm bouncing my head like I'm a bauble in a truck going down a highway. But yeah, no, man, 100%. I'm here with you. Like when you start to get into all this ghost stuff, a lot of people who are fascinated with ghosts ask those questions. They ask those deep questions. What happens to us after we die? You know, one of the most fascinating things that just like it gives me goosebumps, raises the hair on the back of my neck. It was a line in one of the documentaries I watched. Was a guy on YouTube. And I'll share it once this episode goes live. I'll share the link so everybody can watch it. Fascinating thing about one part he says is that having an encounter with a ghost answers that question for a lot of people. You know, yeah. So many people are afraid what happens after you die. But if you encounter a ghost, well, there's quote unquote undeniable proof that there's something after. And in it, there's almost a sort of comfort. You know, in knowing that, hey, there's something more for me after I die. So, like there's psychological foundation there for a ghost encounter being your own mind, like your subconscious going, hey, sucker, wake up. You're not living the life you want to live.
100%. I mean, yeah, you just nailed it right there. And I've done like books on investigations, near-death experiences, etc. Death itself does not scare me anymore because I am convinced there's more, be it there's the spiritual bit, be it that there's a heaven, or you just go to some other plane of existence and keep on trucking, right? Like reincarnation, all this kind of stuff. The part for me that's scary about the process is what we talked about just a little bit earlier, is like living that good life and being the best possible person. Yeah. And I know everyone I know who is an investigator, like a serious investigator who spent time on it, feels pretty much exactly the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I envy you in so many ways, that you get to go out and do all this kind of stuff, and you've done all these things. And, I've always wanted to try doing a ghost investigation, but there's always been that part of me that, like, I'm obsessed with fear. I like it. I'm fascinated by the emotion. I like the mechanics, the machinery that goes on within the human psyche that causes fear to be what fear is. But I don't necessarily enjoy having the shit scared out of me.
But yeah, and you know what's funny is like I like I said, I've been doing this more than 20 years. Like I maybe have been like outright frightened 2 to 3 times. That's it. 2 to 3 times. And I've been to hundreds of investigations, right? Most of it's not scary. Most of it's really boring.
Yeah.
Really boring.
Like talking about personal experiences, which we could get into in part 2 and stuff, but I've only had a handful of them in my life, which were completely unexplainable events that make me believe in ghosts in the afterlife. But it's just, there's just been so many things, not frightening things, but more along the lines of spiritual guidance events that have happened to me that is just like, I cannot deny that something exists after. Like, do I believe in ghosts? Oh man, it's really hard for me to say. Do I believe in God? I believe in something. I don't know if it's God or if it's my ancestors, but there are times in my life where I have faced decisions that I just could not reach an answer to, and the most obscure, unexplainable, just virtually impossible event occurred that helped me make the decision that I was struggling with. And for that alone, I believe in the afterlife. But I also have had myself a handful of like ghost stories, right?
Yeah, and I think if as soon as you start opening yourself up to that possibility, then you just these things start to happen, right? It's all part of, I think, our process of like evolving to a higher plane of existence, for lack, get kind of woo woo. Yeah, I think, but it all plays into that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and much like you, I'm not afraid of dying. And I went through a phase in my life where I was obsessed with the idea of death, and I think it was because I was exposed to it at a very young age. Like I think I was maybe 11 years old when my grandfather passed away. It was like he was basically my quote unquote father figure at the time. A few years after that, I had a friend take his life. And I've grown up around so much death and so much suicide. One of the jokes I used to make when I was in my 30s was like, I've been to 10 times more funerals than weddings. And that's a depressing fact for some, but for me, it was just like, it's just part of my life. So I think my comfort level with death is because of my exposure to it. But for me, my fear of death comes entirely from this. What we've just been talking about this entire day is when I get to that point, if I stand before Amit or judgment or anything like that, is my heart going to weigh in the right direction?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's a good point to end part 1 on, because part 2 is where we get into the whole pop culture experience when it comes to ghosts and phasmophobia. And I'm sure a few more anecdotes will come up on that one. Yeah. So until next week, this is Jason.
And I'm Kenton.
And we'll see you on the other side.